says Phyllis Z. So I'm going to channel Phyllis Z on this. But what we can do is we can look at the slides, and I know I've heard her give these talks before, and I know a little bit about it, but I think it gives some ideas about what she's thinking about for circadian rhythm. She runs a circadian rhythm clinic once a month in Northwestern that gets referred people who have obesity and uncontrolled hypertension, as well as the classic circadian disorders. And she says it takes an average of 3.5 to 4 months of visits, about every every month or so. So it takes 3 to 6 months every month to be able to make a dent into their disorders. So let's just remind ourselves what this is all about. This is the classic two-process model. The references are not particularly correct, but they added in some things. So homeostatic sleep drive increases the longer you've been awake, and then there is this circadian alerting signal that goes up during the day. There's a wake propensity, and then there's the melatonin surge. The wake propensity is really the average of these two drives, and then the melatonin is just to show that there's darkness around the human. Remember that melatonin is not specific for sleep. It's just a time of day for humans where melatonin has its activity in the darkness. But the wake propensity gives you certain clues as to what this sleep-wake cycle drive is all about. The wake propensity goes up until somewhere around noon. It has a dip between maybe 1 and 4, 5 o'clock, and then it goes up abruptly. And that time between about 7 and about 10 is called the forbidden zone, in which people are generally awake, and that's the second wind after having the afternoon dip. And what will become clear is in circadian rhythms, these particular rhythms are out of sync, and they can be out of sync because of either homeostatic drive is different, is inhibited by sleep loss, or maybe even augmented a bit by more sleep. And the circadian alerting signal is out of sync, either endogenously or exogenously. The first observations were that of if you put a plant and it was outside of a box, that you could be able to see during the light, it would have certain sorts of things show up in the light that would not be there in the dark, but yet the same thing showed up in a dark box. So that there was an endogenous rhythm that's seen in plants, and it's thought to be related to the way the earth goes around the sun. And in human circadian rhythms, there are a variety of things that happen, not only in the melatonin, which is thought to be directly related to suprachiasmatic nucleus and its ability to drive melatonin secretion from the pineal gland through the superior through the sympathetic plexus, but also blood pressure, insulin levels, leptin, core body temperature, alertness, mood, and memory. Now, there's certain parts of the day, and these are double. The 24-hour time is double plotted, so you can see it a little bit easier. But you notice that some of the things like insulin levels spike during the day and leptin levels spike more at night. Blood pressure dipping that's in a healthy person occurs at night. Melatonin levels are such as a healthy individual. Core body temperature, you sleep generally as your core body temperature falls, and you wake up as the core body temperature goes up. Mood has kind of two different domains here. I always like that: happiness and cheerfulness. So you might be at times more happy than you are cheerful. And then alertness and memory. Any questions about that? No? Review. All right, circadian regulation of timing of sleep, wake, and performance. And these are four particular corresponding time of the day, 6 a.m., 6 p.m. on either end of that. Let me see if I can get this in the middle somehow, maybe make it a little smaller. No. So subjective alertness, cognitive performance, sleep latency, REM sleep, and body temperature. So certain functional outcomes of this would be: what time of day do you take? Would you prefer to take a test? What kind of day would you prefer to do something that's complex? What kind of day that would you? What time of the day would you do your best exercise, and such and such? The general properties that they're generated by an internal clock. A pacemaker may persist in the absence of cues indicating the time of day or length of day. They're under genetic regulation, but they're also modifiable by environment. The internal clock that regulates circadian rhythms is synchronized or entrained with the light-dark cycle and other social and environmental cues. And those entraining agents can actually reset or phase shift circadian rhythms depending upon the time of exposure of these entraining agents. Circadian rhythms may be delayed or advanced. Now, the most common circadian rhythm is jet lag, and it's probably most everyone has experienced that, and usually more than about 4 hours. It's quite noticeable for 3 to 4 days. But that's a misalignment that then gets realigned. But some people don't align, and some people don't entrain very well. And those are under both genetic and environmental. There's a clock in the brain. That clock in the brain was skeptical when they first identified it. The paired structure, circadian rhythms are abolished with complete lesions, but circadian SCN transplants into the third ventricle and hypothalamus restores rhythmicity in previously arrhythmic animals. So that was hamster studies. Those studies, I think they were in the 60s and 70s, were very important to kind of establish this particular function. And there are different species have different patterns here. This is a mouse, a pigtail monkey, and then a human. And what you see here is this is free running endogenous rhythms in dim light. And these are days, 680 days. And then these are the activity levels and how quickly that mice, or how this runs a wheel and how quickly they do it. But the dark lines are those in which there's very little, and the light is when there's, the light is when there's very little, and the dark is when there's activity. And you can see that these things are fairly, this is double plotted again, 24, 24, so that each is plotted twice. So you can see these bands running. And these were very informative for people to look at how this clock was doing. So you can see that it gets earlier and earlier for that 24-hour time, fragments a little bit as time goes by. In the mouse and the pigtail monkey, they did it for a shorter period of time. But there may be some naps during the day, as well as activity at night. And then the human is a free running. And in this particular instance, and they think that there's a little more than 24 hours, and you draw a line across the edge of this, either the top edge or the bottom edge, and you look at how many minutes there is per day. And in the human, it's about 24. It's about 24 hours and 20 minutes, although more recent suggestions say that it's a little bit, a little longer than that. But that generally it's fairly constant. This is a pretty constant routine, almost like, but it's not brushing your teeth. It's really in your cellular and molecular clock. Exists in single, these genetic instances exist in single cells. Protein synthesis is necessary, and specific genes code for circadian rhythm. So it's not just the capacity is in every cell, and the capacity to have a circadian rhythm then gets clustered into specialized areas like the SCN. And as we now understand that's not only in the SCN is where there is organ specific regulation of circadian rhythm. So what are these genetic components? These are mammalian clock systems. The 2017 was the Nobel Prize because the genes were discovered first in Drosophila, and now they include these per genes, which have polymorphisms in humans, as well as per 1, 2, and 3. And then they have BMAL clock. And what happens is that there's expression of protein. It goes outside into the cytoplasm. It gets hooked onto by various phosphorylations, as well as other coupling of these proteins, per and cry and per, and they go back into the nucleus and generally turn off the production of proteins. And this feedback control occurs in the presence and absence of exogenous forces. You can take cells from the suprachiasmatic nucleus and put them in culture, and they will show a rhythmicity for as long as you can keep that culture viable. So BMAL is in the brain and muscle as well. And there are other clock has circadian, locomotor, and output cycles. There's another one called kaput, which is interesting, but it means that everything turns off. And there's a review in 2020. There's a review almost every other year on that particular mechanism. Suprachiasmatic nucleus, where the light comes in, the major central controller. Takahashi was at Northwestern when he did mutagenesis, radiation mutagenesis in mice, and discovered the clock gene. And in mouse, this was after it had been shown in Drosophila. The SCN regulates through its pathways. It regulates thermoregulation, sleep, melatonin, and corticosteroid secretion, and wakefulness and feeding. It also projects, presumably through the autonomic efferents that are the efferent activity through parasympathetic and sympathetic systems. Not very much is known about that. There's a huge NIH program trying to map all those different networks. But anyway, this SCN projects to the kidney, liver, and lungs, and in some way regulates the circadian rhythm of those organs. Now, that's quite interesting because you would think that the heart has many, many cells and that there are only a few nerves that go to a few of those cells, but the gene expression arrays are found to vary according to time of day in the heart, in the kidney, in the lungs, and have influences when they're knocked out on growth and development. The SCN, you'll hear this, and sometimes they'll ask you these questions. It has what is called the core and the shell. And the core is where the retinohypothalamic tract brings in light to both to the core. And then the shell is the one that projects to these VLPOs, to the PVN, and to the other sleep-related and energy-related and feeding-related nuclei. So one of the common kind of basic science questions is that what part of the SCN obtains the tracks, and that's both is the core, and then what part of the SCN actually projects to these for metabolism, feeding, and sleep, and that's the shell. There's phase resetting, resetting or shift. It's dependent on the time of exposure. So when we now start to think about modifying these things, we need to look at the time of exposure. We need to look at the plot, the phase shift according to the time of day. It's the phase response curve. And light, melatonin, activity, feeding, socialization, and certain drugs can also alter circadian function. The drugs are not very powerful, but they've been shown in animal studies that things like propranolol and beta blockers, which block the sympathetic receptors that are in the pineal gland, can alter circadian rhythm, but it's not terribly strong. Light is the main one. The light is called the Zeitgeber, and that these phase response curves are important when we start to think about the therapy. Now, if I was going to redo this experiment, I'd start with the therapy and then go back into the basic science. So we'll get to the therapy soon. Synchronization occurs in trained to light dark cycles and these other social and environmental cues, and training agents can actually reset or phase shift. So when you start to have certain circadian alerting signals, which then is in that sleep-wake pattern, those alerting signals don't just affect your alertness, they affect your happiness, they affect your cheerfulness, they affect your kind of your mood, your general mood. So when you encounter someone that is particularly variable or is particularly and what I'm thinking about is I'm thinking about people with depression, people that are manic, people that are somewhat inappropriately happy, for instance, is that it may be the part of this is the circadian influences that are there, and circadian effects can be probed by maybe a simple question, which is, have you ever been overseas and traveled to Europe or traveled to Asia? Have you experienced jet lag? Is this how you feel right now here in Cleveland, as though you are jet lagged? And this sense of being out of sync with your feeding, with your bowel movements, with your mood, with your and the fatigue that you feel that's inappropriate, that might be a sort of a middle of the night feel, or something you can ask about. Light is the strongest. It induces a set of immediate early genes, intrinsically photoreceptive retinal ganglion cells, the IPRGCs, circadian photoreceptors, most responsive to short wavelength light, blue, hence the blue blockers, or the blue to be able to provide blue light can change your circadian rhythm, prolong sleep onset. And the blue wavelength is the resetting of the circadian, has been shown to be most effective, although other wavelengths can do it. It's the primary stimulus. It goes in through the retinohypothalamic tract, and it travels down into the brainstem and back up to the pineal gland. So what are phase response curves? Well, phase response curves are if you give a pulse of light or you give a pulse, give melatonin, that it will have varying effects on shifting the phase according to the circadian time of the individual. Now, here the 0 is the set circadian time, and that's usually mid-sleep time. And then if you do it before mid-sleep time or you do it after mid-sleep time, you can either advance or delay the circadian shift. So giving melatonin or light in the middle of the night does very little. Giving light towards the latter part of the mid-sleep cycle will advance. Giving melatonin will delay. Hence, if you do it beforehand, say 8 hours before, melatonin seems to advance, that is, bring sleep forward, whereas light seems to push it back. Now, these phase shifts were shown fairly clearly in long extended studies in mice. And they've been replicated to some degree in human subjects. In the practice guidelines for delayed phase and advanced phase, they try to have you calculate that 0 point in circadian time and have you then have a person experience light at a time in which you might want to change their circadian rhythm. In the case of it being a delayed phase, you'd like to advance it, so you'd like to do it afterwards. So people say, well, maybe 2-3 hours. Actually, about 2-3 hours before you wake up is actually the best, but as soon as you wake up, bright light, blue light in particular. But if you have a person and you sort of say, well, do it in the morning, and they wake up at 7 and they're delayed phase, you could actually have the effect of doing it before their 0 time, and you can actually make them worse by phase shifting them. So that's the sort of questions that are asked on boards, but this is the sort of approach that we also have to think about in humans. So you try to get your mid-sleep time, and then you identify that in either actigraphy or by sleep log or by asking people to try to find out what their best sleep and their best time of day is, and then go from there. So this is the integrator. We've gone over this a little bit, and melatonin is one of the things that probably allows people to get their organs in tune. But B is the inputs to the suprachiasmatic nucleus: sleep, wake, light, locomotor activity, feeding cues. These are all parts of things, and even melatonin feeds back to the SCN. So why is it so complicated? Well, it's a very, very old system. Very old system. You can do this in fruit flies. You can do it now they're looking at circadian rhythm. They found a circadian rhythm sleep-wake cycle in the jellyfish, which has no brain. So it's now, of course, those are fishes. Those are not our direct descendants, but antecedents, but that's what it is. Okay. It orchestrates the hormones, the brain, the autonomic. And so then let's get into these disorders. So the diagnostic criteria, you need to have a recurrent or persistent pattern, usually a 7-day log or actigraphy monitoring, misalignment between endogenous circadian rhythm, light, dark, and exogenous factors. The newer actigraphy watches have a light dark feature, but it's often obscured by someone having long sleeves. People have thought about putting little micro chips in little Band-Aids that you could put behind your ear or behind both ears, which would be ideal, because if you lie on one side or the other, you could see what the light is. The problem with all the business models is that we don't use actigraphy very often, and we don't use it very often because we don't get paid to do it. So it's not something that we can charge for as a test. But I think that that's where part of the wearables are going, is in this direction of being able to be downloaded in your office to be able to look at circadian rhythm, activity, inactivity, and light, dark, and even temperature regulation. I have a new watch, a little watch that has temperature. Unfortunately, it takes a minute for it to give me a temperature, but if it gave me, if it could do it on a regular basis, I could get my temperature profile. I could look at my sleep profile, and those two would be pretty interesting to put together. Circadian related sleep disruption leads to insomnia, excessive daytime sleepiness, or both. And sleep disturbances are associated with impaired physical, social, occupational, and physiological functions. And the quality of life is an issue. If a person stays up late and sleeps in late, that doesn't mean that they have a problem. If they're not disturbed by it, it's not a disorder. It's just they're a night owl, or that they are an early bird. That is and those owlness, owl, lark questionnaires are available. We probably don't use them as much as we should. And when to pull them out from under the drawer or through a digital format is not established. You can see that this is really what they recommend now in the International Classification of Sleep Disorder. This was 2. The 3rd edition is very similar. Disorders are conventional sleep-wake schedule. Now, that's a conventional Western sleep-wake schedule. We've talked about the different cultures have different times of sleep-wake, but in general, there's a major sleep period, and that's asked in a question called, are you generally asleep between 2 and 4 in the morning? And then are you generally awake before 3? Or are you generally awake after 5 o'clock in the morning or 4 o'clock in the morning? Those are the rationales for trying to distinguish kind of a conventional sleep-wake schedule from that of advanced phase, in which it occurs earlier, and delayed phase, in which it occurs later. The colloquial is that you sit there and say, well, I'm in advanced phase because I'm a farmer. Well, maybe that's why the polymorphism for early, for being an advanced phase developed because of the agricultural needs that we had in the Mesopotamia. Or the delayed phase, no one's really quite sure about why the delayed phase disorder is there, although others suggest that it might have been because there is a need for protection, and for certain people or certain, it's an advantage to have certain parts of your collection, your colony, to be awake when others are asleep. There's non-entrained type, in which it moves forward, and that can occur mostly in blind individuals, but it also is found in sighted individuals. And the tests they're usually asked about are the sighted individuals, and they show you a actigraphy in which it seems like there's a later and later onset of sleep, and that goes on for a couple of weeks, and then until they get back into sync again. There's the irregular sleep-wake rhythm, and there's the night shift work disorder. Now, that's just what the sorts of conventional sleep-wake times. Now, insomnia sleep apnea, insufficient sleep. Those particular things impact upon and obscure at times these particular rhythms. But if you start to ask people when do they do their best time of work, and you find that someone does it between the hours of 10 o'clock at night and 1 o'clock in the morning, and gee, they can't get to sleep, and boy, they really need a sleeping pill, doc, and they get given a sleeping pill, that sleeping pill will have them get to sleep earlier, especially if it's a benzodiazepine. And if they stop that benzodiazepine, it goes right back to being a delayed phase. You could work on that with cognitive behavioral interventions, but still you have to recognize it to avoid giving a medication that the doc will say, that the patient will report to you, I have insomnia and I'm on Ambien or I'm on another particular drug. For advanced sleep disorders, that's an interesting one. The older people will say, well, I can't sleep through the night. And immediately a primary care doc might think of sleep maintenance insomnia, but they won't ask when you go to bed. So if they go to bed at 8 o'clock and wake up at 4 o'clock in the morning and complain there's nothing to do, they'll think it's sleep maintenance, and they'll give them a longer acting benzo. So I think when people come in with these different complaints, we need to be asking questions about pre-morbid sleep-wake preferences. I'm always alerted to people who have liked to work third shift or second shift as for delayed phase, and for advanced phase, there's not a lot in advanced phase other than I like to get a lot of stuff done in the morning. There are rumors of department heads who use their advanced sleep phase, their alertness, so they would work in the morning. But if there's a faculty member who had an urgent, I need to see you in the next day or so, they would say, fine, come in and see me at 5 o'clock in the morning. So if you're advanced phase and you're in that particular opportunity to use it to your advantage, because then if it really is important, the person will come in at 5 o'clock. It's a little cruel, but what can you say? These are the different. This was the ICSD2s, but the 3s are there. How they map to the ICD9s. Evaluation strategy is circadian science to understand what time it is in the brain using phase markers. Core body temperature, melatonin is in the hands of the clock. The delayed phase, the inability to fall asleep at desired conventional time. When allowed to choose preferred schedule, patients exhibit a normal sleep quality and duration for age, maintain stable delayed phase. And here's a good example. This is an actigraphy, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, etc. And you can see that he goes to sleep, he or she goes to sleep about 5 o'clock in the morning and sleeps till noon. Now, the melatonin, the dim light melatonin, it will come to your drugstore fairly soon. Again, the problem with the business plan is that not many docs order it, not many people understand it. But I think that with wearables and with people being attuned to what this might be in terms of a marker, the melatonin, in this example, you start at about 10 o'clock at night, and every half hour you spit into a tube, and then you measure the melatonin levels in PGML. So it's a spit test, and what you see is when it starts to get out of the noise, in this case about 1:30, you'll know that you're about 2 hours before, 1 to 2 hours before the desired, or before the actual bedtime. So that's when the melatonin rise, and dim light melatonin onset in delayed phase occurs then, and it would occur earlier in advanced phase. And you don't have to continue into sleep. You just, the last time, until they fall asleep, have them spit every 30 minutes. Phyllis does it in her laboratory in batches. And so once a month, they bring in people's tests. A 27-year-old male, inability to get to work on time, struggled throughout the day, uses Zolpidem and melatonin on and off to help him fall asleep, but no improvement. SSRI for anxiety. Okay. So 68-year-old woman, history of early morning awakening, falls asleep by 8, woken by her son about 10. They go to bed, ideally would like to sleep, ideally between 10 and 6. Wakes up at 3 to 4 and usually can't get back to sleep. So advanced phase disorder is the ability to stay awake until desired conventional clock time. You know, that's such a medical way of saying that, because biologically, you know, you wouldn't ask a dog what their desired conventional clock time would be. And remain asleep until desired and socially acceptable time for a waking. Well, socially acceptable if you're in a social environment. And preferred schedule. Now, in this particular instance, the actigraphy is on the left and melatonin is on the right. You'll notice that it starts at about 4:30 in the afternoon, and it starts to go up around 7 o'clock at night. It's not but the actigraphy then you can see is that usually gets up around 5, goes to sleep around 10 or so. There are familial forms that are autosomal dominant. Genetic analysis for advanced sleep phase is the PER2 gene, and the delayed phase is the PER3 gene. PER3 gene appears to be a consistent candidate for circadian preference. That's the number of tandem repeats, the interest of a region that contains a phosphorylation site. Strength of association decreases with age. Treatment options: chronotherapy, light, melatonin. Hypnotics, unapproved. Melatonin. Now, you know, you could sit there in advanced phase and try to give your melatonin in the morning. And that would be then, that would be at a time in which you would be able to advance your phase on your phase response curve. So, light, melatonin. These are what I showed you before, that the opposite sort of effects. So light and melatonin for delayed sleep phase. Light is commonly recommended in practice, 1 to 3 hour sessions in the morning, although people can say you can get away with it with 30 minutes. Melatonin 0.5 to 5 milligrams early evening. 5 to 7 hours before sleep time is what Phyllis does. 2 to 3 is what you find in the treatment guidelines. But when I reviewed this slide, it reminded me it was 5 to 7 hours before sleep, but desired sleep period. So if it's going to be midnight or 1 o'clock, and you can't do it all at once. So if they go to sleep at 4, you're going to have to sort of bring them back. But I think 2 hours before 2 o'clock, that is giving it at midnight to go to sleep at 2, that might not do much according to what Phyllis says here. And I have to review that, and I'll ask her about that. So advanced circadian rhythm, she's done studies on this. If you have light at 7 to 9 p.m., so how do you get a person who's usually going to sleep at 8 o'clock to have light between 7 and 9 at night? Well, you bring them into a group and you have there's a collection of older people that are living together, either in a home or in a retirement place, is that between 7 and 9, it's usually starting to shut down. But she could show that normalized circadian rhythms improve sleep efficiency, improve total sleep time, and improve performance during the day. So this is advanced and delayed in one slide, and I'll send this PDF to everyone so you can sort of see what that's all about. If this is a normal on the top, you can use advanced phase, you use light, and then the melatonin and the light for the delayed sleep phase. The problem is we don't have these measurements. Now your core body temperature nadir is what is in red, and maybe we can see what wearable has a continuous core body temperature. It's not. It's your wrist temperature. It's your skin temperature. Bright light in the morning, but in extreme cases, begin light upon awakening and adjust as needed. That is, you get one of those lights which is on a timer. There are ones in which will come on and be a bright light over about like dawn, and it can start at early time. Those are expensive though. They're at least they were last time I looked. They were 60, 70 bucks. And then melatonin administered 5 to 7 before habitual bedtime, advances sleep time, or 12 to 12 before wake time. And that the sleep diaries and actigraphy can be used. Analysis of weekday versus weekend logs are important to kind of know what's going on. Now, I think it's important to kind of make sure that there's no backsliding during the weekend. And it's tough in the adolescents. So this is the non-entrained time, and this also has in yellow the light from the actigraph. They drift later and later. This is non-entrained, drifts to the right. Sometimes not as clear as what you can see, but it's not drifting to the left, and it's not solid in the middle. It's sort of moving around. And I think that's the key to identifying it on actigraphy. Note few days with high light exposure induces a phase shift, and the rhythm remains entrained for about 4 days before drifting again. So those are the bright lights. Non-entrained type highlights 40% of blind people, rare in sight overlap, children with mental retardation or with handicaps, multiple physiologic, behavioral, and environmental factors. Autistic children seem to have have circadian gene dysregulation as well, but can be treated socially and environmentally, as well as it can be produced socially and environmentally. I have a patient that's in one of the group homes down in Shaker Square, off of Shaker Square, and I visit them about once a month or so, trying to treat his sleep apnea by coaxing him to use CPAP. But I would think that those are particularly interesting, vulnerable populations for sleep disorders of circadian rhythm type. Non-24 hour timed melatonin administration. That's the guideline. Shifting by melatonin in the sighted, and that's when a person has light exposure. And at one time there was a thought that there was vitamin B12 was important. This is irregular activity, inactivity, Tuesday, Wednesday, just chaotic, irregular sleep-wake cycle. I think actigraphy will be particularly important in this group. There's central circadian regulation, there's behavioral environmental cues, and there's neurological and medical disorders. So it may be that they're not as responsive to light. And there may be changes in SCN, particularly in those in which there may be some central dysregulation of cellular growth and development of the brain. Poor sleep habits. Bright light may improve irregular sleep wake. 8 of 9 studies positive. Nursing home residents. 2 hours of bright light. Melatonin not indicated with dementia, but may be indicated in children. The reason for that is melatonin knocks them out. Mixed modality approaches. So this is this slow medicine sort of approach to the circadian rhythms. And I if I had a lot of bandwidth, we'd probably be sending graduate students into nursing homes and group homes to collect data and try to do some interventions. Shift work disorders. We need to know that there are neoplastic disease, there's comorbidities with this, temporal association with insomnia, shift work. At least 1 month is the diagnostic criteria. True prevalence in night rotating shifts is 14 to 8%. You would think it might happen in everybody, and that would be an interesting study in which you get bunches of shift workers and find, yeah, these have shift work disorders, but what are the things that people do to not have shift work disorder? Is there a particular behavioral or so therefore remediable, or is there a biological sort of per polymorphism, per gene polymorphism that sort of gets them to do that? Because there are certain people that really have a preference for shift work and say, that's fine, that's all I need to do. All right. Coming down here, treatment of shift work, sleep hygiene, avoid bright light in the morning, have a dark bedroom. I think we even have handouts for this. Hypnotics, dress short acting only, melatonin, duration of daytime sleep, a little effect on alertness during work. 1 study, not very good. Stimulants, modafinil. Now, Arkenstead is Scandinavian that looked at a lot of shift work. Very bright guy. Looked at shift work, errors in shift work, errors over a 24-hour period. And he's a proponent of caffeine because it's cheap, it's available, and people do things. It has side effects. So circadian misalignment and sleep deprivation. So now we start to get into polymodal sorts of advice. And here we need colleagues, our advanced our psychology colleagues. And this is where we need to sort of layer these things on. And this slide might be important to print out and put out in color and put it out in clinics. Sort of remind us about all the things that we need to do for circadian misalignment. But in general, it's sort of, I think we're going to have to be much more multimodal in our treatment approaches to be valuable to patients and to systems. Jet lag, temporary desynchronization, sleep loss, malaise, insomnia, hypersomnia, and fatigue. Gee, doesn't that sound like every depressed patient you talk to? And direction of travel, east, difficulty falling asleep, and west is difficulty maintaining sleep. Number of time zone travels, inter-individual differences, owl and lark, and also age. Older people tend to not have as much jet lag. And speed up the realignment, light exposure and avoidance at the appropriate times. Going west, get morning light. Going east, avoid light in the early morning and get as much light as possible in the afternoon, early evening. Melatonin, if you go eastward, 3 to 5 milligrams at bedtime. And short-acting hypnotic could be useful. And a lot of people sort of say that you should have some short-acting hypnotics in your medicine cabinet, because there are times in which people need to sleep, and this may be one of them. So this is what happens: typical flight time going east, and New York, Paris, and they ask you all sorts of questions about what to do. And in this particular instance, you want to be able to avoid the bright light. As you're going to sleep, but you want to have the bright light as you're waking up. So human health, new frontier. That's where it's going. Circadian rhythm, brain tissue specific gene dysregulation, regulation of sleep-wake cycle, and all these different things, different parts of your body that have to be in sync. Now, how does this? Is health really circadian? A circadian alignment with sleep, and maybe sleep health is within that circadian alignment, and part of that